Can I get a refill when you have a second? Of course, sweetheart. Same thing, just the drip. Thank you. I never thought a Tuesday morning at my favorite cafe would be the last time I ever felt like a normal woman. The place was called Greenleaf, one of those bright, airy spots with exposed brick walls, big sun-drenched windows, and hanging plants trailing down from the ceiling like little green curtains. I'd been coming here almost every day for the past 8 months. Same corner booth, same black drip coffee, same worn-out green sweater I always threw on because it was soft and it didn't remind me of anything painful. My name is Victoria Woods. I'm 29 years old, and for the last 2 years, I've been trying to rebuild a life that a man named James Morgan spent 4 years tearing apart. It took me 18 months after I finally left him to scrape together enough courage and documentation to file for a restraining order. 6 months ago, a judge granted it. I thought that meant I was finally safe. That morning, I was reviewing applications. I'd been applying to every office manager position within a 15-mile radius, trying to stack enough income to cover first and last month's rent on a new apartment before my landlord followed through on his eviction threats. My braids were pulled over one shoulder. My coffee was still hot. The cafe was full, maybe 20 people, and the barista, a college kid named Devin, had just brought me my refill with a little smile. That's when I heard the chair. Not a chair being pulled out, a chair being kicked. The sharp crack of wood against the hardwood floor, and then the bell above the front door still ringing because he hadn't even let it close behind him. James. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be within 300 feet of me. The restraining order had been active for 6 months, but James Morgan never cared about paper. He never cared about rules. He only ever cared about one thing, making sure I knew I couldn't leave him. I saw him before he reached me. Dark gray t-shirt stretched tight across his chest. Dark jeans. That walk, shoulders forward, jaw locked, fists already curling at his sides. I knew that walk. I'd memorized it the way you memorize the sound of a tornado siren. It meant something terrible was about to happen, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. I tried to stand. I tried to grab my bag and my phone and move toward the back exit near the restrooms. But he was already there. 3 long strides, and his hand was in my braids. Not grabbing, wrenching. The pain was immediate and blinding. My knees buckled and I went down, my hips slamming into the hardwood floor next to the overturned chair. My coffee cup hit the ground and shattered, sending a spray of hot liquid across the wood. I could feel the shards under my palms as I tried to catch myself. You think you can just disappear on me, Victoria? His voice was low, controlled, almost calm, and that was always worse than the yelling. The calm meant he'd been thinking about this. Planning it. James, please not here. His other hand locked around my upper arm, squeezing so hard I felt the bruise forming in real time. He dragged me sideways, my knees scraping against the floor, my hands clawing at his grip on my braids. I could feel strands ripping from my scalp. The cafe went silent. That particular silence I'd come to recognize in the worst moments of my life, the silence of people who see something terrible and freeze. I could hear someone gasp. I could hear a phone camera shutter click. Devin, the barista, was standing behind the counter with his mouth open, a rag in his hand, completely frozen. Nobody moved. They never do. They pull out their phones, they cover their mouths, they whisper to each other. But nobody moves. James leaned down over me, maximizing every inch of his height and his build, and I could smell the stale cigarettes on his breath and something sharper underneath adrenaline, maybe, or rage so concentrated it had a scent. You belong to me. You hear me? You don't get to walk away. You don't get to sit in some little cafe and pretend I don't exist. My vision was blurring. Not from tears I'd trained myself not to cry in front of him a long time ago, but from the pain radiating across my scalp and down my neck. My hands were shaking as I tried to pry his fingers loose, but he was so much stronger than me. He'd always been so much stronger. And then I heard something I didn't understand at the time. The quiet, deliberate sound of a button being unfastened. Before we start, go ahead and subscribe, like, and share where you're watching from. It always warms my heart to see our little storytelling family stretch across the world. Every click, every comment, every bit of love you give helps us keep uncovering these unforgettable stories together. So find your quiet place, settle in, and let me take you somewhere you've never been before. I didn't see him stand up at first. I was on the floor, my face twisted in pain, my green sweater bunched up around my shoulders, my braids wrapped around James's fist like a leash. But later, when I replayed this moment 1,000 times, the other people in the cafe told me exactly what it looked like. From the corner table in the back of the room, the table nearest the exposed brick wall, the one that always seemed to be reserved even though the cafe didn't take reservations, a man rose to his feet. He didn't push his chair back quickly. He didn't jump up. He stood the way a judge stands when he's already decided the sentence. His name was Muhak Kun, but I didn't know that yet. What I knew, what everyone in that cafe knew the moment they looked at him, was that this man was not like anyone else in the room. He was tall, Korean, striking in a way that made you look twice and then look away, because something about his face told you that holding eye contact too long was a mistake. He was wearing a tailored, dark navy blue suit that fit him like it had been sewn directly onto his body. Crisp white shirt, dark tie, every line precise, every detail immaculate. In a room full of people in jeans and sneakers and aprons, he looked like he had been cut from a completely different world and placed there by accident. Except it wasn't an accident. I'd find out later that nothing about Muhak Kun was ever an accident. His posture was perfectly straight. His expression was ice, not angry, not shocked, not concerned, just still, the kind of still that a blade is before it moves. His eyes, dark and flat and utterly unreadable, tracked from James's hand in my hair down to my knees on the floor and then back up to James's face. And in that single, slow sweep of his gaze, something in the atmosphere of the cafe shifted. It got cold. Not the temperature. The air itself seemed to tighten, like the room was holding its breath. Then he did it. The thing that everyone would talk about afterward. The thing that Devon, the barista, would describe to the police 3 times because he couldn't believe what he'd seen. Muhak Kun lifted his hands, and I saw them for the first time. Both hands, from the knuckles to the wrists, were covered in intricate, dark tattoos. Not the kind of tattoos you get on spring break. These were dense, deliberate, almost architectural patterns that wrapped around each finger and climbed beneath the cuffs of his pristine white shirt, like a secret the suit was barely containing. They were the kind of markings that told a story you didn't want to hear. He gripped the lapels of his suit jacket, and slowly, with the calm of a man who had done this before and would do it again, he unfastened one button. Then the next. He didn't shout. He didn't rush. He didn't pull out a phone or call for help or look around for someone else to handle it. He simply unbuttoned his suit jacket the way a surgeon puts on gloves. And James, who had never been afraid of anything, who had put me in the hospital twice, who had broken a restraining order like it was a suggestion James looked up. And for the first time in the 6 years I had known him, I saw something cross his face that I had never seen before. Fear. Hakkun took one step forward, then another. His polished shoes made no sound on the hardwood floor. His tattooed hands hung loose at his sides, relaxed, open, like weapons that hadn't been drawn yet. The bystanders near the door pressed themselves against the wall. A woman pulled her child behind her. Nobody said a word. He stopped 3 feet from James, close enough that James had to tilt his head up slightly to meet his eyes. And then Hakkun spoke. Just 2 words. His voice was low, quiet, and carried the kind of authority that doesn't come from volume. It comes from the absolute certainty that whatever you say next will be the last thing that matters. Let go. James's grip on my braids loosened, not because he wanted to, but because his hand was shaking now. His jaw was still clenched, his ego still burning, but his body understood something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. He had just made the final, fatal mistake of his life. And the man standing over him, the man in the navy blue suit with the tattooed hands and the frozen expression, was about to make sure he understood exactly what that meant. James didn't let go. Not completely. His fingers loosened in my braids, but his pride wouldn't let him release me. He was still gripping my arm, still leaning over me, still trying to convince himself that he was the most dangerous thing in the room. He wasn't. Hak-kun closed the remaining distance in 2 steps. No wasted motion. No theatrics. He moved the way water moves through a crack fluid, inevitable and impossible to stop. His left hand came up and caught James's wrist, the one tangled in my braids, and I heard a sound like a green branch snapping. James made a noise I'd never heard come out of him before. Not a scream, something more primitive than that. Something from the back of his throat that said his body had just received information his brain couldn't process. My braids fell loose. The pressure on my scalp vanished so suddenly, it almost hurt worse the way silence hurts after an explosion. Hak-kun didn't stop there. His right hand came around and caught James by the throat. Not squeezing, guiding. He pivoted James's entire body away from me like he was redirecting a piece of furniture, and then he drove him backward into the nearest table. Coffee cups shattered. A laptop slid to the floor. James's back hit the table edge and his legs buckled, and Hak-kun pinned him there with one hand on his collar and one knee pressed into his thigh. The whole thing took maybe 4 seconds. James swung. Of course he did. His free hand came around in a wild, desperate hook aimed at Hak-kun's jaw. Hak-kun tilted his head barely, a few inches at most, and the fist sailed past his ear. Then he delivered a single, short strike to James's solar plexus. No wind-up, no warning. Just a precise, compact punch that collapsed James's lungs like someone had flipped a switch. James folded. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. His eyes bulged. He slid off the table and crumpled to the hardwood floor, curling into himself, gasping for air that wasn't coming fast enough. Hak-kun stood over him and straightened his cuffs. One, then the other. The tattooed hands were perfectly steady. He didn't look down at James again. He was already done with him. Instead, he turned to a point somewhere behind me, and for the first time I realized there were 2 other men in the cafe who hadn't been there before, or maybe they had, and I just hadn't noticed them. Which was probably the point. Both Korean. Both in dark suits, though not as fine as Hak-kun's. One was already on his phone. The other was moving toward James with the calm, practiced stride of someone who had cleaned up situations like this many times. Hak-kun said something to them in Korean. 3 short sentences. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the tone. It was an instruction list. Do this. Handle that. Make it disappear. Then he looked at me. I was still on the floor. My knees were raw. My palms were cut from the ceramic shards. My braids were disheveled and my green sweater had slid off one shoulder, and I was shaking so hard my teeth were clicking together. I must have looked pathetic. I felt pathetic. But the way he looked at me, it wasn't pity. It wasn't the way the bystanders were looking at me, with that awful mixture of horror and relief that it wasn't them. His expression was still controlled, still measured, but something behind his eyes had shifted, like a door had opened an inch and then immediately closed again. He extended his hand, palm up, tattooed fingers open and still. I took it. I don't know why. I'd spent 2 years flinching away from every man who reached toward me. But his hand was steady, and mine wasn't. And something about the way he waited patient, unhurried, like he would stand there with his hand out for an hour if that's how long it took made me reach back. He pulled me to my feet gently, firmly, but gently. Then he shrugged off his suit jacket and draped it over my shoulders without asking. It was warm and it smelled like sandalwood and something darker underneath, like smoke from a fire that had been burning a long time. "Come with me," he said. Not a question, not a command either. Something in between. I looked back at the cafe. Devon was still behind the counter, pale as paper. The bystanders were whispering now, some still filming, some with their hands over their mouths. James was being hauled to his feet by the 2 men in dark suits, his face gray, his breathing still ragged. One of them had already collected my purse and my phone from the floor. I walked out of Greenleaf with Hak-kun's jacket around my shoulders and his hand hovering, not touching, just hovering at the small of my back. A black car was already waiting at the curb. The door opened before we reached it. I got in. I didn't ask where we were going. It wasn't a house. It wasn't even an apartment. Not in any way I understood the word. It was the entire top floor of a building I'd driven past 100 times without ever looking up. The elevator required a keycard and a code, and when the doors opened, they opened directly into a foyer with marble floors and a view of the city that stretched so far I could see the river. Hak-kun led me through the space without narration. No tour, no explanation. He brought me to a living room with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that looked like it had never been sat in, and he gestured to a long gray sofa. "Sit. I'll have someone look at your hands." I sat. I pulled his jacket tighter around myself. The shaking hadn't stopped. Within 10 minutes, a woman arrived. Mid-50s, Korean, carrying a leather medical bag. She didn't introduce herself. She just knelt in front of me, took my hands in hers, and began cleaning the cuts with a solution that stung but smelled like antiseptic. She checked my scalp where James had torn at my braids, pressing her fingers along my hairline with clinical precision. She examined the bruise already darkening on my upper arm, 5 distinct marks, one for each of James's fingers. The whole time, Hak-kun stood by the window. He wasn't watching the doctor. He was watching me. His arms were crossed over his chest, and his jaw was set so tight I could see the muscle working beneath the skin. His body was perfectly still, but something about him radiated a fury so dense it had weight. It filled the room like a low hum you feel in your chest more than here. The doctor said something to him in Korean. He responded without looking at her. She nodded, packed her bag, and left. "Nothing is broken," Hak-kun said after a moment. His voice was quieter than it had been in the cafe. "The bruising will take time." "I need to go home," I said. "No." I looked up at him. "Excuse me?" He turned from the window. His expression hadn't changed still, that controlled, glacial stillness, but his eyes were different now, darker, like something behind them was burning and he was using every ounce of discipline he had to keep it contained. A man who violates a restraining order in a public place at 9 in the morning is not a man who will respect a locked door at night. You're not going back to that apartment. Not tonight. I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him I wasn't the kind of woman who let strangers make decisions for her. To tell him I'd been handling James on my own for 2 years, and I didn't need some man in an expensive suit deciding where I slept. But the words didn't come. Because he was right. And we both knew it. I stayed. I tried to go back to normal 3 days later. Hak-kun had a driver take me to my apartment while 2 of his men waited in the car downstairs. I told myself I just needed clothes, my documents, my laptop. 20 minutes and I'd be out. The door was already open when I got there. Not unlocked. Open. The deadbolt had been ripped clean out of the frame, leaving a jagged hole in the wood like a wound. James had been there. Everything I owned was destroyed. Not tossed around destroyed. My clothes were shredded with something sharp, piled in wet heaps on the bathroom floor. My laptop was smashed, the screen cracked into a spiderweb of dead pixels. The kitchen drawers were pulled out and dumped. My one framed photograph me and my mother at my college graduation was on the ground, the glass broken, the photo torn in half. On the bedroom wall, written in what looked like black spray paint, 2 words, "Come home." I stood in the doorway and felt something collapse inside me. Not sadness, something worse. The exhausted, flattened feeling of realizing that no matter how far you run, no matter how many restraining orders you file, no matter how many times you change your locks and your number and your route to work, he will always find a way to remind you that you are not free. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered it without thinking. "You think that suit is going to protect you?" James's voice, low and venomous. "I know where you are, Victoria. I know where you sleep. And your little boyfriend can't watch you every second of every day." The line went dead. Hak-kun's men were already in the apartment behind me. One of them was on the phone, speaking rapid Korean. The other was photographing every inch of the destruction with a methodical calm that told me this wasn't the first crime scene he'd documented. When I got back to the penthouse, Hak-kun was standing in the foyer. He looked at my face, whatever was on it, whatever expression I was wearing, and he didn't ask what happened. He already knew. He just said, "Your room is ready." I moved in that night. I didn't have a choice anymore, and pretending I did was a luxury I could no longer afford. The room he gave me was larger than my entire apartment. Private bathroom, a closet already stocked with clothes in my size, simple things, quality fabrics, nothing flashy. When I asked how he knew my measurements, he said the doctor noted them during her examination. I didn't know whether to be grateful or unsettled. I decided on both. The first few days were strange. The penthouse was vast and immaculate and almost entirely silent. Hak-kun kept irregular hours. Some mornings I'd come into the kitchen and find him already there, drinking black tea and reading something on a tablet, his suit jacket off, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, the tattoos on full display. Other mornings the apartment was empty, and I wouldn't hear his footsteps until well past midnight. We orbited each other carefully, politely. Like two people sharing a space neither of them had planned on sharing. He never entered my room. He never touched me. He never raised his voice. But his presence filled the apartment the way a low-frequency sound fills a room. You couldn't always hear it, but you could always feel it. One evening, about a week in, I found him on the terrace. The city lights were spread out below us like a circuit board, and he was standing at the railing with a glass of something dark, staring out at nothing in particular. His tie was loosened. His hair was slightly disheveled. He looked, for the first time since I'd met him, tired. "Can I ask you something?" I said from the doorway. He didn't turn around. "You can ask." "Why me?" A pause. Then, "What do you mean?" "I mean I gestured vaguely at the penthouse, the view, the entirety of his world. "You're all of this, and I'm a woman who can't even keep her apartment. Why did you step in? Why are you doing any of this?" He took a sip of his drink. The ice shifted in the glass. "Because I was there," he said, "and no one else was going to." "That's not a real answer." He turned then, looked at me with those dark, unreadable eyes. "You want a real answer?" "Yes, because I've watched people suffer when I had the power to stop it, and I did nothing, and it cost me everything that mattered. I won't make that mistake again." He said it simply. No drama, no self-pity, just a fact, delivered with the same precision he did everything else. But beneath the words I could hear the weight of something enormous. A grief so old it had fossilized, become part of the architecture of who he was. I didn't push. Not that night. But the quiet between us shifted after that. It went from careful to something else, something warmer, something with gravity. We started eating dinner together, not planned, just overlapping. He'd cook sometimes Korean dishes, precise and methodical, the way he did everything, and I'd sit at the counter and watch his tattooed hands move through the motions. We talked about small things, my job search, his opinion on American coffee, which was low, the hanging plants at Greenleaf, which I missed more than I expected. And slowly, piece by piece, the walls came down. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, careful increments, like two people learning a language neither of them was fluent in. It was past 2 a.m. when I found him in the living room, sitting in the dark. No drink this time. Just him and the city lights through the window and his hands resting on his knees, palms up like he was studying them. I almost turned around, almost went back to my room, but something about the way he was sitting still, but not calm, more like a man holding himself together through sheer force of will, made me stay. I sat down on the opposite end of the sofa. I didn't say anything. I just waited. After a long time, he spoke. "You asked me once what the tattoos mean." I looked at his hands. The intricate dark patterns I'd noticed that first day in the cafe, winding around each finger, covering his knuckles, climbing past his wrists. In the low light, they looked almost alive. "Their names," he said. "Not written in any alphabet you'd recognize. Each pattern represents a person, someone I failed to protect. Someone who was taken because I was too slow, or too careful, or too busy building an empire to notice that the people inside it were dying." His voice was steady, but his hands weren't. They were trembling barely, almost imperceptibly, and that small, human crack in his composure told me more than anything he'd said out loud. My mother, my younger brother, two men who trusted me with their lives and shouldn't have. A woman who worked in one of my restaurants and was killed because a rival wanted to send me a message. He turned his right hand over slowly. Every mark is a debt I carry. A reminder that power without vigilance is just a more comfortable way to lose people. I looked at the tattoos more closely now. The patterns were beautiful in a devastating way, intricate, layered, each one distinct from the next. And then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Near the base of his left ring finger, between two dense patterns, there was a gap. A small, deliberate space of bare skin, perfectly measured, waiting. "What's the empty space?" I asked. He looked at me, and in his eyes, for the first time I saw something that wasn't control or authority or calculation. It was honesty. Raw, unguarded, terrifying honesty. "That space is for the next man who threatens someone I've chosen to protect." He didn't say James's name. He didn't have to. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I reached over and placed my hand on his, my palm against his tattooed knuckles, and he went very still, not pulling away, not leaning in, just absorbing the contact like a man who hadn't been touched gently in a very long time. We sat like that until the city started to lighten at the edges. Neither of us spoke, neither of us moved. And in that stillness, something between us sealed shut a door that had been open, deciding whether to close or to open wider, finally chose. It opened. If you're hooked on Victoria and Hak Kun's impossible love story, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell, because the next chapter is going to be insane. Comment below Team Victoria's independence or Team Hak Kun's protection. Don't miss what happens next. Their bond is about to face its deadliest test yet. I found out about the building on a Thursday. I wasn't supposed to. Hak Kun kept his business dealings in a separate wing of the penthouse, a room with a heavy oak door that was always closed, and that I never tried to open. I respected his boundaries the way he respected mine. That was the unspoken contract between us, and for weeks it had worked. But that Thursday morning, his lieutenant, a quiet, broad-shouldered man named Sang-ho, who rarely spoke more than 3 words at a time, left a folder on the kitchen counter, plain manila. No label. He'd set it down while pouring coffee and walked away to take a phone call, and the top page was visible because the folder wasn't fully closed. I wasn't snooping. I was reaching for the sugar bowl, but my eyes caught 2 words on the document and my hand stopped midair. Greenleaf Cafe. I pulled the folder toward me. Inside was a property transfer agreement dated 6 weeks before the attack. 6 weeks. The document showed that the entire building, the cafe, the 2 floors of apartments above it, the storage basement below had been purchased in full by a holding company I'd never heard of. The purchase price was redacted, but the signatures weren't. At the bottom of the last page, in sharp, angular handwriting, was a name I recognized. Mu Hak Kun. I stood in that kitchen for a long time. The coffee machine hissed and clicked behind me. The city hummed 30 floors below. And I felt something rearrange itself inside my chest, not breaking, not healing, something more fundamental than either. Like finding out the ground you've been standing on was placed there on purpose. 6 weeks before the attack meant he'd bought that building while I was still just a woman in a green sweater ordering drip coffee at her usual table. It meant he'd been watching me before James ever walked through that door. It meant the corner table that always seemed reserved his table hadn't been a coincidence. None of it had been a coincidence. I thought about Mr. Petrovic, the building's previous owner, a heavy man with yellow teeth who owned not just the cafe space but the apartments above it. Devon had told me weeks ago that Petrovic had been threatening to jack up the lease, squeeze every tenant out, and sell the whole property to a developer. The cafe might not survive the year, Devon had said, wiping down the counter with the resigned look of someone already updating his resume. But then the threats had simply stopped. Devon had been confused. Relieved, but confused. Now I understood. Petrovic hadn't changed his mind. He'd lost the building. Because a man I didn't yet know had quietly, without announcement or expectation, removed the threat before anyone even realized it existed. When Hakoon came home that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen counter with the folder open in front of me. He saw it immediately. His eyes went to the documents, then to my face, and something flickered across his expression, not guilt, not embarrassment, but a kind of resigned acknowledgement, like a man who'd been carrying a secret he always knew would surface. "How long?" I asked. "How long were you watching me before that day?" He set his keys on the counter. "Long enough to know that you deserved better than what you had, and long enough to know that no one else was going to make sure you got it. You bought an entire building. You were about to lose the only safe place you had left. I wasn't going to let that happen. I should have been angry. Part of me was a sharp, defensive part that had spent years learning to distrust men who made decisions on my behalf, but the anger couldn't hold its shape. Because this wasn't control. James bought me things to own me. Hakoon had bought a building to keep me standing, and he'd done it so quietly that I was never supposed to know. "You could have told me," I said. "Would you have accepted it?" "No." The corner of his mouth lifted just barely, just for a second, and then it was gone. While I was learning the depth of what Hakoon had done for me, James was busy building something of his own. I didn't know the details then. I'd learn them later, in pieces, from Sang-ho and from police reports, and from the fragments Hakoon chose to share. But this is what happened while I was falling in love in a penthouse 30 floors above the city. James Morgan, out on bail after the cafe incident, because the American justice system treats restraining order violations like parking tickets, had been making phone calls, not to lawyers, not to family, to people who operated in the same shadows Hakoon did, but without the discipline or the code. There was a syndicate on the east side, a loose, violent operation that had been trying to encroach on Hakoon's territory for over a year. They ran protection rackets and moved product through a network of nail salons and check-cashing stores. Their leader was a man named Roman Salko, and Salko hated Hakoon with the specific, festering hatred of someone who had been humiliated by a superior and never recovered from it. James found Salko through a mutual connection, some low-level criminal he'd met during a previous arrest. And James offered him something Salko couldn't resist: detailed information about Hakoon's movements, his security patterns, his blind spots. James had been stalking me obsessively enough to observe Hakoon's routines, what time his car arrived, how many men accompanied him, which routes he took. In exchange, James wanted one thing: me, delivered back to him, by force, with Hakoon out of the picture permanently. Salko agreed. Not because he cared about James or his domestic grievances, but because removing Mu Hakoon would open up half the city's underworld like a cracked safe. They set the date. They chose the location. And they waited. It happened on a Wednesday evening. Hakoon had taken me to dinner, a small Korean restaurant in a part of the city I didn't know, the kind of place with no sign on the door and a host who bowed when we entered. We'd been doing this more often, going out together, not hiding, not performing, just existing in each other's company with a comfort that still surprised me every time I noticed it. He'd given me something 2 weeks earlier, a small handgun, matte black, compact enough to fit in my coat pocket. I'd stared at it like he'd handed me a live snake. "I don't know how to use this." "You will." He'd spent 3 evenings teaching me in a soundproofed room in the basement of one of his buildings, how to hold it, how to breathe, how to aim for center mass and not hesitate. I didn't like it, but I understood why he insisted. In his world, love without preparation was just a prettier way to grieve. That evening, the gun was in my coat pocket when we stepped outside the restaurant. Sang-ho and another bodyguard, a younger man named Jae-won, quiet and sharp-eyed, flanked us on either side. The car was parked 20 feet away, engine running. The street was narrow and quiet and poorly lit. I felt Hakkun's hand tighten on my lower back half a second before I heard it, the screech of tires from both ends of the street simultaneously. 2 black vans, no headlights. They cut off the exits like a trap snapping shut. Sang-ho moved first. He shoved me behind the parked car and drew his weapon in the same motion. Jae-won was already firing short, controlled bursts aimed at the van on the left. The noise was catastrophic. Not like movies. Real gunfire is concussive. It hits your chest and your eardrums at the same time and turns your thoughts into static. Men poured out of the vans. 6, maybe 8, armed, wearing dark clothing and moving with the sloppy aggression of people who rely on numbers instead of skill. They spread across the street in a loose formation, firing wildly. Hakkun pulled me down behind the engine block of the parked car. His expression had changed. The ice was gone, replaced by something sharper, more focused. A predator who'd been ambushed but wasn't surprised. He reached into his jacket and produced a gun I hadn't seen before, larger than mine, and started returning fire with the same brutal precision he did everything else. A bullet punched through the car's rear window and showered us with glass. I could hear Sang-ho shouting in Korean somewhere to my left. Then I heard Jae-won cry out a short, clipped sound, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting pavement. Sang-ho's voice changed pitch, barking something urgent. I didn't look. I couldn't. Then the chaos separated us. Another burst of gunfire drove Hakkun forward, toward the van on the right, where 2 men were trying to flank the car from behind. He moved low and fast, firing as he went. Sang-ho followed, and suddenly I was alone behind the car with my back against the tire and my hand in my coat pocket, gripping the gun he'd given me. The old Victoria, the one from 8 weeks ago, the one on the cafe floor with James's hand in her braids, would have frozen, would have curled into herself and waited for someone else to save her. But that woman was gone. She'd been replaced by someone who had been taught to breathe, to aim, to act. I saw the man before he saw me. He came around the front of the car from the passenger side, young, wiry, holding a pistol in both hands like he'd learned from television. He was moving toward Hakkun's exposed back. Hakkun was focused on 2 shooters in front of him. He didn't see the third. I didn't think. Thinking would have stopped me. I pulled the gun from my pocket, planted both feet, aimed the way Hakkun had taught me center mass, exhale, squeeze, and fired twice. The man stumbled sideways. His gun clattered to the pavement. He hit the ground and didn't get up. Hakkun turned, looked at the fallen man, looked at me. In the flashing chaos of muzzle fire and screaming tires, our eyes met for 1 second. And in that second, something passed between us that neither of us would ever need to say out loud. The remaining attackers broke. Without coordination, without their numbers advantage, they scrambled back toward the vans. Sang-ho dropped 2 more before they reached the doors. 1 van peeled away. The other stalled. Its driver slumped against the wheel. The street went quiet. The kind of quiet that only exists after violence, thick, ringing, temporary. Hakkun crossed the distance between us in 3 strides. His hands found my face, my shoulders, checking me the way the doctor had that first day, except this time his fingers were trembling and his jaw was clenched so tight the tendons stood out like cables. "Are you hurt?" "No." He pulled me against his chest, held me there. His heart was hammering the first time I'd ever felt evidence that he was human underneath all that control. I felt mine hammering back. Behind us, Sang-ho was kneeling beside Jae-won. I heard him say something low in Korean, not a command this time, something softer, something that sounded like a name repeated twice. When I looked over Hakkun's shoulder, I saw Sang-ho pressing his jacket against Jae-won's side, and I saw the dark stain spreading beneath it. Jae-won was breathing shallow, ragged, but breathing. An ambulance would come. Hakkun's people would make sure of that. But the young man's sharp eyes were glazed now, and the quiet efficiency he'd carried himself with was gone. replaced by the fragile stillness of someone fighting to stay conscious. Another name, I thought. Another pattern waiting to be inked if the worst happened. The reckoning came 48 hours later. Hakoon didn't tell me where he was going. He didn't need to. I saw it in his face when he left the penthouse that night. The suit pressed sharper than usual, the tie knotted tighter, the tattooed hands flexing at his sides like they were rehearsing something. He kissed my forehead at the door, and the tenderness of it was terrifying because I understood what lived on the other side of that tenderness. He took Sang-ho and 4 other men. I stayed in the penthouse with 2 guards at the elevator and 1 on the terrace. I sat on the sofa in the dark living room and I waited. I learned what happened afterward, not from Hakoon, he never spoke about it directly, but from the absence of fear that followed, from the way my phone stopped ringing with unknown numbers, from the way the tension in the penthouse dissolved like smoke from a dead fire. James Morgan was found by police 3 days later in the back office of one of Salco's check-cashing stores. Salco was there too, along with 4 of his men. The police report used words like altercation and rival dispute and evidence of significant physical confrontation. The newspapers called it a gang war casualty. Salco's operation, the nail salons, the rackets, the entire East Side network collapsed within a week. His lieutenants scattered. His territory was absorbed so cleanly it was as if the syndicate had never existed. Salco himself disappeared from public record entirely. No hospital admission, no arrest, no obituary. Just gone, the way people go when they cross a line drawn by someone who doesn't believe in second chances. Nobody investigated further. Nobody ever does when the people involved are the kind of people nobody misses. James was alive. Hakoon had made sure of that. Not out of mercy, out of precision. James Morgan was alive in a hospital bed with injuries that would take months to heal, facing federal charges for conspiracy, stalking, assault, and violating a protective order across multiple jurisdictions. The evidence against him was overwhelming and meticulously organized, as if someone with vast resources and intimate knowledge of the legal system had spent weeks assembling it. He would go to prison for a very long time. And even when he got out, if he got out, he would carry the memory of what happened in that back office for the rest of his life. The memory of tattooed hands and a quiet voice explaining, with absolute clarity, the consequences of ever speaking my name again. When Hakoon came home that night, it was past 3 a.m. I was still on the sofa. He walked in, hung his jacket on the back of a chair, and sat down beside me. He smelled like cold air and exhaustion. "It's done," he said. 2 words. The same economy of language he'd used that day in the cafe. Let go. It's done. He built entire worlds with 2 words at a time. I leaned into him. His arm came around me, and for the first time in years longer than I could remember, I felt the specific, physical sensation of safety. Not the temporary safety of a locked door or a restraining order. The permanent, structural safety of knowing that someone had chosen you, completely and without condition, and had proved it in every way a person can. I asked about J1 the next morning. "He'll recover," Hakoon said. He was standing in the kitchen, pouring black tea, his sleeves rolled up, his tattooed hands moving through the familiar routine. He didn't elaborate. But I noticed a new weight behind his eyes, the kind that accumulates every time someone under your protection pays a price for standing beside you. 7 months later, I stood in the middle of a restaurant that had my name on the lease. Not Greenleaf, something new, something mine. Though Greenleaf still stood, Hakoon had kept it running, installed a new manager, and made sure Devin the barista got a raise he didn't understand the reason for. I went back once, about 4 months after everything, sat in my old corner booth, ordered a black drip coffee. It tasted the same, but I didn't. The woman who used to sit there in a worn-out green sweater, flinching at loud noises and counting coins for rent, she was gone. I didn't miss her, but I honored her. She had survived long enough for the next version of me to exist. The new place was called Ember, high-end. A renovated building with exposed beams and soft lighting, and a menu I'd spent 3 months developing with a chef Hakoon had introduced me to. I'd spent those months buried in spreadsheets and supplier meetings and kitchen trials, learning the business from the foundation up because I refused to be a figurehead in my own restaurant. Hak-kun had offered to handle the logistics. I'd told him I wanted to learn. He'd looked at me with something that might have been pride and said, "Then learn." So I did. I learned inventory management from his restaurant managers. I learned negotiation from watching him close deals over the phone. I learned that running a business was not so different from rebuilding a life you started with what you had. You made decisions every day, and you refused to let the fear of failure keep you from showing up. The tables were set with linen. The bar was stocked. The kitchen was gleaming. The deed was in my name. Not Hak-kun's, not a holding company's. Mine. He'd insisted on that. When I'd pushed back on the funding because my hyper-independence still flared up like an old injury in cold weather, he'd said something I'll never forget. "I'm not giving you this. I'm investing in you. There's a difference, and I expect returns." He'd almost smiled when he said it. Almost. Opening night. The place was full. Sang-ho stood by the front door in his usual dark suit, looking deeply uncomfortable, surrounded by civilians eating appetizers. Jae-won was there too thinner than before, moving carefully, but there, he'd insisted on coming. He stood near the bar, nursing a glass of water, and when I'd thanked him for being here, he'd just dipped his head and said, "I wouldn't miss it." The waitstaff moved through the dining room with practiced elegance. The kitchen hummed. And at the corner table, because there was always a corner table, Hak-kun sat with a glass of dark tea and watched me work the room. He was wearing the navy blue suit. The same one from that day in the cafe, or one identical to it. His posture was straight. His expression was calm. His tattooed hands rested on the white tablecloth, and I noticed, as I passed him on my way to greet a table of guests, that the empty space near his ring finger was no longer empty. It had been filled in, the final mark in his ledger, the last debt settled. He caught me looking and held my gaze, not smiling, not frowning, just present, steady, there. The way he'd been there since the beginning, since before the beginning, since before I knew his name, since a morning I thought would destroy me, turned out to be the morning that delivered me to the most dangerous, most devoted, most impossibly gentle man I'd ever known. I walked over to his table, leaned down, pressed my lips to his cheek, right at the edge of his jaw, where the scent of sandalwood was strongest. "Thank you," I whispered. He turned his head slightly. His mouth was an inch from my ear. "You never have to thank me, Victoria. You just have to stay." I straightened up, smoothed my dress, looked out over my restaurant, my name, my menu, my future, and felt the full, staggering weight of what it means to be rebuilt by someone who never asked you to be anything other than exactly who you are. I stayed. Can Victoria truly escape the cycle of violence that has haunted her for 6 years? And what will happen when James realizes that the man protecting her isn't just some stranger in a suit, but the most dangerous crime boss in the city? Smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications because you do not want to miss what happens next. This story is about to get even darker. Drop a comment. Do you think Victoria can learn to trust again? Or will her past destroy the one man willing to burn the world down for her? Like this video if you're obsessed with this unlikely bond between a woman rebuilding her life and the Mafia boss who chose her before she even knew his name. The next chapter drops soon, and trust me, you are not ready for what Hak-kun's tattoos really mean or the blank space he's saving on his hand. See you in the next one, if James is smart enough to stay away.